Meanwhile, in Quebec and Canada, you can't rely on the science and you can't rely on the courts. Viva Frei, former Montreal litigator turned current Florida rumbler. For those of you who missed it, I did an awesome interview with Steve Kirsch earlier today. I've got a bit of time this afternoon to do a vlog before we go see Andrew Dice Clay stand up tonight. I don't think I've been out of the house in a long time. This is going to be date night with the missus while the kids stay occupied. Oh! Andrew Dice Clay, here I comes. But if you want to have a good laugh, and by laugh I mean a cry, the latest news coming out of Quebec. A woman challenged the Quebec curfew. For those of you who don't know, Quebec was the only province in Canada to impose a curfew, not once, but twice, year over year, even though, according to Horacio Arruda himself, there is no science to show that a curfew is a useful tool in battling a virus.
Why are you threatening people taking walks in the evening to get a fine? What will that change in the fight against COVID? The measures that we set up for COVID are cumulative. There is no science that can tell you that such and such a measure will have such and such percentage of efficacy.
Anyhow, a number of people challenged the COVID curfew, and most recently a woman, I think her name is Stephanie Pepin, took it to trial because she was issued a ticket for being out after curfew. She lost her case, but I want to do a bit of a summary before we get into her losing her case. For those of you who don't recall, it was January 2021 we were put under what was supposed to be a 4-week curfew, if memory serves me correctly, and it lasted about 5.5 months, and it worked so well that they did it again the next year. But when they implemented the curfew, the government, being smarter than anybody out there, they made certain exceptions. If you had a dog, you could walk your dog after the curfew, at least during the first one. That rule didn't apply to cats, and it didn't apply to spouses. There was a woman who walked her husband on a leash, still got a ticket. So while the government was imposing wholly unscientific measures to battle a virus, it was thinking of all the exceptions. If you had a dog, you could go out to walk your dog at night, and that's when I started the Viva on the streets. If you had to be out for work, you could be out for work. If you had papers to show that you had a right, a need, a necessity to be out of your house, oh my goodness, at the end of this video, I'm going to play a 3-minute clip of Supreme Leader, Fascist Dictator François Legault explaining all of this. Listening to it in retrospect, you would have to think people were idiots to abide by this. I objected to it, but I still did abide by it, and I was one of the idiots. But my goodness, you listen to this, and it sounds like a joke. It seems like an absurd joke that you wouldn't believe if it were scripted into a movie, and my wife is here. 2 minutes. But just to highlight some of the absurdities at the time, you had activist organizations suing so that the injunction wouldn't apply to homeless people, and it actually required an order of the court that exempted the homeless from being subjected to a curfew from 8 o'clock at night to 5 in the morning. Imagine that at the same time they were limiting capacity of homeless shelters. They were limiting people's ability to work. They were making it impossible for the homeless to find shelters. They then wanted to impose a curfew on the homeless, and you had one judge who said, no, this doesn't make any sense. This basically criminalizes homelessness. And at the time, I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this might be the first step in the series of many steps where the courts are going to come in and say, no, this doesn't make any sense. But no, Canada's Quebec retreats on homeless curfew requirement after court order. Quebec Premier François Legault opposed changing the rule, arguing residents could pretend to be homeless while arguing that adequate shelter would be available. The pandemic has taken a toll on Canada's vulnerable and unhoused. A January study published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal found that Ontario residents with a recent history of homelessness were more likely to test positive for coronavirus and over 5 times more likely to die within 21 days of a positive test. Quebec Superior Court Judge Chantal Massé on Thursday granted an injunction suspending the curfew's application to the homeless, arguing that their, quote, lives, security, and health were being put in danger, end quote. Donald Tremblay, director of the Mobile Legal Clinic, which spearheaded the court action, said, quote, it's about time, end quote. The government backed off. Quote, it was completely absurd not to exempt the homeless, end quote, he said by phone. Yeah, you try to make the science make sense in all of this, but there was another injunction requested where the court did not issue the injunction as relates to drug users. The court came to the conclusion that there wasn't enough evidence that the curfew would harm drug users. I'm not joking about all this. This is the headline. Quebec rejects bid for emergency halt to Quebec curfew, saying not enough proof it harms drug users. Montreal, a Quebec court rejected a challenge to the province's curfew on Friday, saying there's not enough proof it has led to a rise in overdoses to grant an emergency injunction as advocates requested. A Montreal harm reduction group mounted commented, the legal challenge saying the curfew currently at 9:30 p.m. in Montreal puts intravenous drug users at risk, while saying there's no proof it actually cuts down on COVID-19 transmission. Along with COVID-19, the jump in drug use and fatal overdoses is also a compelling public health crisis, Montmorency said. Quote, there really is an increase in overdoses, and that is why, for us, this is an emergency, end quote, she said. The judge hearing the case ultimately sided with the government's key witness, a public health doctor who argued the curfew is part of an overall strategy to fight the pandemic. While the judge accepted that the curfew does harm drug users, he said the proof presented so far doesn't rise to the level needed to justify granting an emergency injunction from the preliminary hearing. There was also another case in which a lawyer filed an injunction arguing that the curfew violated his charter rights, and a judge from the Quebec court came down and said, no, it doesn't violate your charter rights. All right, knowing that that's how the courts had ruled in the past, I was not the least bit surprised that they rejected this woman's bid to claim that the curfew was unconstitutional and that her charges should be dropped. From True North, court upholds Quebec government's COVID curfew. Stephanie Pepin was charged by police for being out in public past 8 p.m. on January 9, 2021, while she was on her way to attend a 9 p.m. protest against the curfew. The curfew was imposed by Quebec Premier François Legault's government earlier that same day. Quebec was the only province in Canada and the only jurisdiction in North America to place a curfew on its citizens.
Yes, science!
Trust the science, follow the science, and apparently the science is jurisdictional and different science in different provinces. Pepin challenged the fine under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, arguing that sections of the Public Health Act were unjustified and violated her constitutional rights to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. Justice Marie-France Beaulieu found the curfew justified. Quebec's National Director of Public Health, Dr. Horacio Arruda, and Dr. Richard Massé, the architect of the Public Health Act, were both subpoenaed by Pepin's lawyers to justify the curfew. Quote, there have been dozens of challenges to the curfew law, but this one was different. This is the first time in Canadian history that the crafters of the laws under scrutiny were questioned under oath, and it became evident they had no constitutional basis on which to act, end quote, said lawyer Olivier Séguin, who represented Pepin. Pepin intends to appeal the ruling. Don't hold your breath, Pepin. I do not see any court of appeal overturning this decision. As absurd as it is, that is the state of the law. That is the state of the court system in Quebec and Canada. That is the state of overt fascism in Quebec. And when you see this video of François Legault, you will have no doubt that what we went through was an absolute Milgram experiment. Anyhow, I've got to go edit this video and go to see Andrew Dice Clay. So if you like my stuff, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe. Follow me on Rumble, Viva Frei on Twitter, the Viva Frei. You can follow us on vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
Oh!
We have an amazing community out there, 117,000 strong members, not necessarily supporters. Everyone in that community is above average, but if you choose to support us, $10 a month, $100 a year at the discounted rate, it is well worth it if I do say so myself. But most importantly, get out there, exercise, sunlight, eat healthy, talk to people in real life, and now you know your vlog. Peace out, peeps. Booyah!
Good evening, everyone. In recent weeks, the pandemic has worsened around the world, including here in Quebec. The situation in our hospitals is critical, especially in Montreal. There are still too many visits in homes. That's why I'm announcing that starting next Saturday, there'll be a curfew from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. during 4 weeks. So after 8 p.m., we won't be allowed to go out in streets except for work. During the day, we also need to reduce contacts in houses. Many non-essential activities will also continue to be closed until February the 8th. It'll be mandatory to work from home for office workers. All non-essential businesses as well as places of worship will remain closed until February the 8th. Funerals will be authorized for a maximum of 10 people. Groceries will have to close at 7:30 p.m. Pharmacies and gas stations will be allowed to stay open. Regarding schools, I think it's essential that children continue to learn, so we'll reopen primary schools on January the 11th as planned. But all children will have to wear a mask outside the classroom, and children in 5th and 6th grade will have to wear a mask in the classroom. Secondary or high schools will continue online and reopen on January the 11th. All teachers and students will have to wear a procedural mask. We'll distribute 2 masks per day to everyone in every school. Regarding libraries, it's already allowed to borrow books. From January 11, children will be also allowed to go there to study. Outside activities will still be allowed as long as it's with people in your bubble. I know those measures are tough for our mental health, but we have to balance that with the situation in our hospital. The situation is very serious. The virus is especially dangerous for people over the age of 65. I ask them to be very careful and to stay home as much as possible. We all need to stay home as much as possible for the next 4 weeks. Police officers will be there to make sure everybody respects the rules. We see the light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccine, but we need to reduce the contagion right now, and I'm counting on you all. Thank you.
You are the worst human being I have ever met.